Welcome to GPS, God's Prophetic Surprises, the program where we tackle the book of Revelation in a multi-generational fashion. The program that I believe meets the needs of today's world, as well as giving us insight into the ancient world. Now you may wonder, this looks different. We're not in the studio, but we're in very special circumstances. The COVID-19 circumstances mean we cannot go into the studio, and yet at this time, perhaps more than any in recent history, serious understanding of God's will and God's ways is more important than ever before. And so we've decided to pull together a program that will be kind of like the news reports that are happening at this time as well. So I'm Jon Paulien, a professor of religion at Loma Linda University. And the one with the scarf is?
This is an ULA. It's for this momentous occasion of pioneering a new platform. My name is Shifra Pulayai, and I'm a pastor at Campus Hill.
Thank you, Shifra. And then on my other side, I see Viana.
Hi, I'm Viana Chambers from the Calamasa Church.
All right. And then we have Guilherme.
Yes, I'm Guilherme Borda, and I am a PhD student at Andrews University.
Awesome. Very good. And finally?
And my name is Philip Milo Sablovich. I am a young adult pastor at the Loma Linda University Church.
All right. Well, how are you guys faring during this special time when everybody's kind of confined to their homes? And here we are together in this special fashion. It's kind of exciting. It's going to be fun. But how are you coping with the isolation and some of the challenges of finding food and things like that?
Yeah, in our family's life, it's been definitely very different. My wife works in the hospital, and so there's been a little bit of concern for her safety. But God has definitely blessed us also with a little bit more time. I'm a pastor and haven't been able to go into a church setting or meet with church members in the same way. So we've been able to spend a little bit more time intentionally together as a family in spite of this. And so we've kind of taken on some gardening projects and playing in the courtyard of our house and just enjoying our 1-year-old who's now running around, and we're trying to keep up with her.
Yes, I think a lot of people are dealing with small children that otherwise would be in school or in some other setting, and that's been exciting for them. Shifra, what about you?
Well, I'm not homeschooling anyone, but I am editing a lot of videos, and so I've had to watch tutorials and figure out how to help the church by doing something I haven't really done before. Yeah, and it's good. I'm hosting a prayer vigil this weekend with the church, and I'm happy to see people gathering like we are today in creative, innovative ways, making things happen, even with our limitations.
Well, these are special times. I'm having Zoom meetings with England, Philippines, China, places like that. So you can have personal conversations that weren't really too possible before. Guilherme, what about you?
Yes, it's been a little bit challenging for my schedule as a student and my wife's schedule as well. We don't get to have the help of the babysitter and all of those things, but at least we haven't so far been impacted by the disease itself directly, and I think that's the most important. So we try to make the best of the time that we can.
Awesome. Viana?
I have been trying to define what presence looks like in my pastoral life. There's been a couple of incidents and crises that really take you out of this comfort zone because your first instinct is to show up, right? And without that there, we've had to really redefine, reframe what presence and support looks like. So that has been a really interesting, beautiful transition in a way. And I love that we can connect through Zoom, although a lot of us have Zoom burnout. But there's something very intimate about like seeing other people's homes and feeling like you're in their home versus like meeting at church or at anywhere else. So there's been also that intimacy, although we're through video cam. And on the plus side, for me personally, I told you guys that I have a recent pregnancy. I'm about halfway there. And so it gets really tiring, and I'm able to take naps on demand and not have to ask permission from anyone. So that has been such a blessing for me.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful, wonderful. And that, I believe, is a GPS announcement, isn't it?
Yes.
All right. And how far along are you in this pregnancy?
About 20 weeks, which is about the halfway mark, give or take a few weeks.
Awesome. Well, we're going to be talking today about a childbirth in the book of Revelation. Some people might be surprised there is one in there, but there is. And we'll get to that in a moment. Any advice any of you would have for managing the situation? If anybody out there's...
Yeah, I would say spending time doing things that are energizing. Exercising is something that people are allowed to do. So I would consider really getting out there, walking, gardening, running, getting on a bicycle, finding a place where you can still be at a safe distance, but getting out in nature has been just so rejuvenating for myself and our family.
Guillermo?
I would suggest, in fact, I've been thinking a little bit about this. Now, a lot of people have had a little bit more flexibility in their schedule or even extra time. Of course, that does not apply to the healthcare workers and all of those people who have maybe lost their jobs and are trying to find an alternative income. But a lot of people do find themselves in a situation where their schedule is more flexible or they have more free time. And this is what I would suggest, that we work so we avoid falling in the trap of living lives of constant and soul distraction instead of lives of reflection, right? And maybe taking the extra time that maybe came up to dig into the scriptures and to really get closer to God. That's what I would suggest, that we take this opportunity to build those spiritual habits, that spiritual discipline of getting in the Word of God.
Nice. I like that. So that stuff that people say, if I only had time, there's no excuse. Now is the opportunity. Yes. Very good. I was just thinking, Viana, you do a lot of children's ministry. Are you able to connect with the children on Zoom?
Yes, we have created Sabbath schools through Zoom, and I love the personal touch. So I've been writing some letters out to them and sending stickers through the mail. And we've done a collaboration with other children's pastors in our conference where we put out the Sabbath school service every week for ages about 5 to 10, give or take. So that has been a really neat way to connect with the kids. But yeah, Bible studies, everything continues to be through Zoom. And I don't prefer that. That's a little distracting. It's not like I can hand them objects and teach them and run through the Bible. There is that element that it's taken away from a child's very active brain and learning style.
Well, I found with the grandchildren in Hawaii, it's kind of hard to keep them pinned down to wherever the adults are talking. So what they sometimes do is just give one of the kids the phone and have them give us a tour of the yard or the house. And of course, you're often looking at the ceiling or the sky or other things like that. But it keeps them engaged with their grandparents, which is nice. But looking forward to the day when we can be face to face again. Well, Book of Revelation. We've gotten started in Revelation chapter 12, and it's an exciting story, actually, as it begins. It's a story with 3 characters. You have a woman in distress. That's always part of a good story. You have a dragon. Everybody loves dragon stories. And you have a baby. What can possibly go wrong with this story? Totally awesome. And what I want to remind you from our previous programming is that when the author of Revelation introduces a new character into the story, he hits the pause button of the ongoing story of Revelation and takes time to describe the character physically, and then give a little bit of the backstory of that character before hitting the play button and moving on with the story. So in this case, the woman appears. There's a description of her. She's standing on the moon, dressed in a certain way, and she's in childbirth, about to give birth. She's in month number 9, okay? And Viana has a few months to go to get to that point and fully understand what this biblical character is going through. But then comes the dragon, and verse 3, description of the dragon, and then verse 4, a little bit of his backstory, particularly the one about dragging a third of the stars out of heaven. And one thing we concluded on, just summarizing to get us back to where we are today, is that we noticed when it came to the dragon's tail, it looks like a very violent act. The dragon drags a third of the stars out of them, rips them out of the sky, throws them to the earth. It sounds like an extremely violent act, and yet it isn't. Because Bible apocalyptic isn't always what it appears at first glance. What you see is not always what you get. And I'll turn it over to the rest of you in a minute, but I just want to take people back to Isaiah chapter 9, which is a background to this concept of the tail. Isaiah 9, verses 13 through 16. And I'll be reading the NIV. It says, "The people have not returned to him who struck them, nor have they sought the Lord Almighty." So he's talking about Israel here, an Israel that has not been faithful to God. And notice why they're not faithful. Verse 14, "So the Lord will cut off from Israel both head and tail, both palm branch and reed in a single day. The elders and prominent men are the head. The prophets who teach lies are the tail. Those who guide this people mislead them, and those who are guided are led astray." So here in Isaiah, God is describing a situation where Israel has gone astray. They have fallen away from God, and the reason is put on their leaders, the political leaders, the elders, the prominent men, the spiritual leaders, the prophets. They're being told lies. Something is told to be truth, and yet it's not true. When the dragon drags the stars out of the sky with the tail, it's a hint, in that Old Testament context, it's a hint. The dragon didn't bring these stars down by force, although the language is force. He brought them down by persuasion. He used his mouth telling them lies. So, any of you want to make a comment about that setting? And then we can move on to verse 5.
In verse 9, we do see, the same verse that we mentioned, I think, last episode. I think Philip brought it up as a way to identify who is this dragon. And the great dragon was thrown down, the serpent of old, who is called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. So we know that the dragon is a deceiver.
Mm-hmm. Right. Very, very good point. In verse 9, the dragon is elaborated with many names, and one of those is deceiver. So you combine the two, the tail and verse 9, and you can see very much that while the language in Revelation 9 will be violent, while it may be full of military language, and we'll see that a little bit later in the chapter, when you dig below the surface, this is not a war of tanks and planes and armor. It's a war of words. And in the New Testament, military language is almost always used for words, for the Christians' battle to deal with the issues in their life. Go ahead, Philip.
Yeah, I wanted to say, it's interesting because in this section of scripture, this is the first time we see the word dragon used in the New Testament. There was a usage of dragon back in the Old Testament in the book of Ezekiel, and then a few other places in Isaiah, Nehemiah. But this, again, is the first time in Revelation we're introduced to this character, Satan. So all of a sudden now the book of Revelation is taking a turn of being a little bit more explicit about who is the enemy of the people of God. and what is this enemy trying to do, and why the enemy is trying to do it. So this next section is very interesting for that regard, that we get a deeper look into the story of Christ and the enemy.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Viana, would you like to read verse 5 for us and continue the flow of the story?
Okay, reading from the NRSV. And she gave birth to a son, a male child, who was to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was snatched away and taken to God and to his throne. Do you want me to keep reading?
Oh, that'll be fine. Just verse 5. All right. So all of you have been reading this text. What do you do with verse 5? What do you see going on there? Or let me give you a leading question. It's a new character. So where's the description of this character?
I think I know where you're going. Where you're going with this. Just because I'll be very honest. I've watched videos of you speaking about this video, so I know where you're going with this. I don't want to like spoil, so I'll let the other ones answer the question.
Oh, okay. We won't let you spoil it then.
No.
Yes. Do you see a visual here? Description of the baby, what the baby looks like.
I mean, we have. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Male child, ruler of all nations. I mean, I feel like there is no better description than Jesus.
Right. Definitely. But is there a physical description?
Just male.
Just that it's male. Okay. Is there a backstory?
In a sense, if you consider his time within his mother, the woman, if you will.
Okay, so time with the woman, but it doesn't really say much about his backstory. In fact, it tells his forestory, I guess, what he will do in the future. He is about to rule the nations with a rod of iron. So what happened to the idea that new characters require a visual, etc.? And for me, the exciting piece here, because this will help us to see something in this text I think that's very critical in a moment. And that is that if the character's been in the story before, then you don't need the introduction at the same level. And this character has been in the story before. Viana, you said it was who?
Jesus.
You see it as Jesus. And what leads you to see Jesus in this event?
Because that's who the dragon tries to attack. That's my leading clue.
Okay, so the dragon, if we know the dragon is Satan, as is told us in verse 9, then the assumption is this is his great opponent. And mother and child would echo the Christmas story as well. So, and earlier in the book, Jesus is the one who rules the nations with a rod of iron in Revelation itself. So that is another piece that does it. But there's more. Is there any other place in the New Testament where you have a threat against the baby?
Yeah. And the massacre of the Hebrew boys, that caused Mary and Joseph to have to flee from Bethlehem to Egypt.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so all of this coming together, you have echoes of Satan with the dragon, but you also have echoes of Herod, the king who tried to destroy the babies. And in the Bethlehem story, he misses the one that he was actually attempting to get. And in this story, the dragon misses again.
Right.
So it's telling the story of Jesus in a nutshell. And so this is one of the parts of Revelation that most people agree on. I think you open up almost any commentator and they will agree with you, Viana, that this is a picture of Jesus. And only two things of Jesus' life are actually here: the birth and the ascension to heaven. Those are the two things. At the end of this verse, he ascends up to God and to his throne. So there's no visual. He doesn't go before God's throne. He goes to God's throne. So that suggests that this figure is divine. He goes to the throne. So he is able to access the throne. Most other people come before the throne and bow down and all the rest of it. He comes to the throne. And when we saw him as the Lamb in chapter 5, he was in the midst of the throne. He's right in the center of the throne. Yes, Shifra.
I also have in my notes that verse 5 is connected possibly to Psalm chapter 2, verse 9, the part where, here, let me see.
Yeah, why don't you read that for us? Mm-hmm.
Sure. It says, you shall break them with a rod of iron. And just before that, in verse 8, it says, verse 7, I will declare the decree the Lord has said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me and I will give you the nations for your inheritance.
Okay. So this is further evidence that that we're dealing with Jesus here.
A divine child.
And in Psalm 2, you have that context of the Lord and his anointed in the opposition of the kings of the earth and the rulers. So you have that there too. And then that will be played out as you keep going in the next chapters of Revelation.
All right.
I mean, in verse 5, we also catch the ascension of Christ. If we're pointing to the male child as being Jesus, then we also see that this is the space where, I mean, a lot happens between here, the giving birth and then going up. I mean, this is the life of Jesus, his ministry, and then his death and ultimate resurrection and ascension to heaven. All that happens within verse 5. And then it goes into the woman and her story.
And the interesting, it seems to me, just off the top of my head, this happens in Revelation a lot because Jesus appears to each of the 7 churches, but only with a piece of himself. He comes to them with 1 or 2 or 3 characteristics from the vision of Jesus in the previous chapter. So when he appears to the churches, it's a limited picture. And here again, we see Jesus, but it's a limited picture, just his birth and his ascension to heaven. Doesn't say anything about the cross. That will come later in the chapter. Anything else you want to say about verse 5?
You know, the rod of iron imagery is a little harsh for me, and I don't usually attribute that to Jesus. I mean, the first thing that you see is whipping people into shape, right? There's this harshness about iron. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, I was hoping you would speak to that.
Children's pastor.
Yes. Yes. Well, the rod certainly would seem to be a shepherd's rod, in that a shepherd's rod is one that they use to guide. And by the way, let me just take a closer look here. I have the Greek text in front of me, and it says to rule them with a rod of iron. The word for rule there is the word for shepherding. So it probably doesn't have the kind of thing, all right, I'm going to rule them with this rod of iron and going to pound them over the head. All right, that's the first glance. But you go below the surface and he shepherds them with a rod of iron. Now, the rod of iron still tells us that in the end, he will win. In the end, God will be victorious. And those of us who know him are glad for that. Because if you're going to be subject to anybody, it ought to be someone that has your best interests at heart. And that's the God that the New Testament teaches us to understand. So I don't know, does that help any?
I would just say one thing. Of course, if we go to the context of Psalm 2, these rulers that are in opposition to God, they're complaining. If you go to verse 3, or verse 2, the kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, now verse 3, Psalm 2, verse 3, let us tear their fetters apart and cast away their cords from us. And then verse 4, he who sits in the heavens laughs, the Lord scoffs at them, then he will speak to them in his anger and terrify them in his fury, saying, and then you go into later that enthronement motif. So, but when you think about it, the fact that you have these rulers complaining, almost as if, like, the idea that seems to be there is that God is restraining their power. God is limiting their exercise of power. If I'm interpreting it correct, that makes me think of what you find in Revelation, where you see these beastly powers that, in a sense, represent the creaturely excess, right? When creatures trespass their creaturely boundaries and try to usurp God's power, and therefore they rule in an oppressive manner. And then God, on the other hand, he's the one who is the only proper ruler who needs to restrain the powers of these creatures. And that's actually for our good, because if these rulers had unlimited power, and sometimes they're allowed to have more power, sometimes less, and the more power they have, the more they destroy. So I would see, in a sense, the rod of iron can be very comforting, because it is, in a sense, a way to restrain the oppressor. I mean, that's how I would see it.
So what you are saying, he's not using the rod of iron on the sheep, which is, I think, what Viana's worried about. Am I right? What do you think of this? Viana, what do you think of what he said? Yeah.
Protect the little children at all costs, but just don't use an iron rod. But there is something so comforting when you're faced with, it's not even described as a snake, right? It's described as a dragon. And to even have worded it as like a wooden staff against a dragon versus an iron rod against maybe these powers and people trying to trespass on God, in a way, it's like, yeah, that's going to be a little bit more, like, I trust that a little bit more. And in that context, it is more comforting to think it's going to be used on the sheep.
So seen in context and with Guillermo's helpful background information, then this seems to be a protective image rather than a violent one. And if the enemies are coming at you with spears and swords, you probably don't want a wooden staff. An iron staff might give you a fighting chance. And God is assuring us that he's strong enough to protect us. Getting to the end of our time, anyone have a 10-second word? All right.
I encourage people to recognize that God is on his throne here in the text, and that's a beautiful reality, that you can hope in Jesus who's ruling on the throne.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Well, this has been an unusual session of GPS. There may be more like it on the way, but we're grateful to be with you in this way, and we're looking forward to seeing you again next time right here on GPS.